I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, Teagasc specialist Patrick Gowing identifies the cost of expanding your farm business, and he started by giving an idea of the profile and reasons for expansion.
Roughly speaking, about 52 or 3% of the time it's new entrants that we're doing business plans for, and the remainders are the expanding dairy farmers.
And, looking at these guys and girls that you're working with, what is the justification farmers have for expansion?
From a new entrant point of view, they're looking at their current business, potentially not making as much money for their effort they're putting in, and exploring the option of getting into dairy and to get a higher return off their farm. The existing dairy farmers mostly are successful businessmen already, or business people, and they want to expand their business and take advantage of new opportunities as they arise.
And actually, with that in mind, looking at new opportunities, in terms of expansion, there are some people who maybe would have had a lower stocking rate and they've intensified their farm business. And then you have other people who are looking at maybe a second unit, or there's extra land coming on the milking platform. So, say that the next door neighbour has 60 acres coming on stream. A lot of farmers consider this a no-brainer, and I'll take that 60 acres and I'll expand my herd by 50 or 60 cows by knocking the hedge. Is it as simple as that, Patrick, or what should we consider in that scenario?
I think all expansion should be considered and carefully planned out. As we grow our businesses and as we take into other expand it or take on additional land, there's always a level of risk, and we have to manage that risk. So I suppose the key thing for any farm is that if you're not efficient or profitable with the original or the base herd, you have to look at within your own self before and fix that before you look to expand. And I think sometimes while there may be an opportunity, it's not always for you, and there could be as much money made by solving or improving on what you have already, and when you have that right, then look to expand. But I think if any farm has an opportunity or land beside comes up, it is worth sitting down and doing the figures and looking to see, is it for you or not for you.
And like a quick rule of thumb on some figures, Patrick, like as you mentioned, you're doing a lot of business plans and you have done a significant number over the last few years. Looking to that, what sort of figures would you put on? I suppose firstly, if we'd look at stock, if you're buying a heifer that's ready to calve down or a cow, what sort of a figure would you put on that?
So in calf heifer, probably been purchased September, October, the year before she calves. We'd normally budget in around anywhere between 13 and 1500, depending on the year. So last year, some people got value due to the lack of fodder. Currently, they're anywhere between 13 and 1400 euro. It's probably one area that we would emphasize to invest wisely, particularly from a new entrant point of view, that while you may be able to get cheaper stock, maybe 100 or 200 euro cheaper, you have a huge opportunity in the initial startup to go off and source the best genetics, and that'll stand to you for the rest of your time on the farm. And what we would see is new entrants outperform existing dairy farmers, the average of existing dairy farmers within 2 years of startup. And predominantly, while some of its management is also the genetics they bring into their farms.
And then looking at the cow, are there many people, I suppose, starting off or, expanding and mightn't necessarily have the young stock coming along? Are they seeking out cows, or is it primarily heifers?
Primarily heifers. One is to maximize the gain. So the younger the animal, hopefully the better the genetics if you source them right. When sourcing cows, there is always an opportunity, and sometimes you can, maybe as someone shutting down their business or closing down, that you may get an opportunity. But generally speaking, people are after younger cows, second or third calvers. And if a farmer is selling them cows, there's usually some sort of issue behind them, generally speaking, because a cow will only hit her full potential in year 3. She's at 70% production in year 1 and 85% in year 2. So it's very hard to get them type of young cows. And in an expanding farm, when you are pushing on and your business plan is based about hitting a certain amount of output and a certain number of cows, if we lose a lot of stock, so if you bought in lame cows or high cell count cows or cows with fertility issues, while they may become cheap, they won't last within the system, and that can put a lot of pressure because you have a higher replacement rate on the business.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you make, Patrick. You know, a cow in a herd that's closing down is a viable option, but you don't necessarily want to buy problem cows. And you know, in a existing and thriving dairy business, you know, you're not getting rid of your best cows, so the heifers probably would be the better option there.
Yes, and I know a lot of people say like if you go to the better herds and the higher bred herds and look for the figures, the quality of the heifers are there are far superior than ones that are bred off stock bulls, and you will get paid back within the first year. As I say, a lot of new entrants they're hitting serious targets within the first year based on the stock that they have. So while a lot of people would think that you get a lot more production from your cows, if she turns out to be a trouble cow or a slow milker or a bit of lameness, a good heifer could potentially yield as well in the first year. And key to the thing is she probably will be still there in 5 years' time, where the trouble cow will be gone.
And looking forward then to other costs of expansion, is there any rule of thumb in terms of a figure you'd have for milking facilities, grazing infrastructure, farm layout? Is there any figures that you have offhand, Patrick?
Yeah, I suppose, look, every farm is different, Emma-Louise, and as part of what we do or through Teagasc is you have to investigate every farm. So some farms will have more facilities or be easier to convert, while other people have less. But the rule of thumb, I suppose the one area we would always focus on first, and it's the area that's often forgot about, is the grazing platform, making sure that you have the farm and the access to grass and the quality of grass up to standard. And taking a sort of a moderate farm that needs all to be reseeded in index 2, needs a bit of lime, needs roadways and water, that roughly speaking could cost 2,000 a hectare, or in around €800 a cow to put in place. So that would include the water system, roadways, fencing, reseeding, and soil fertility. So depending on your farm, then obviously if you have some sort of a grazing infrastructure in place, it'll be less, or if it's a tillage type conversion, it'll be up on that type of money. As we move into the housing, generally, again, there's a massive range, and it'll depend on what the farm is set up and the current sheds that they have, which we average in around €1,100 for a cubicle shed, excluding the slurry storage. That's per cubicle space. In around €530 to €550 per cow on slurry storage. That'll be slatted slurry accommodation. The silage pit will be about €250 a cow. And if you add in other things, including calf housing and calving, you could spend up into €2,000 a cow. Now, for the majority of farmers, they have some of these things in place, like the silage pit might be already there. They'd have sheds that could be easily converted. They'd have some sort of sucker housing maybe, or fattening housing, that some sort of slurry accommodation that we'll be able to utilise in the plan that will significantly reduce that cost. But if you have to put it all in there, it'll come into somewhere around 2,000 a cow. On the milking parlour, again, there'll be a massive range within the milking parlour, but you'll be talking about €1,400 a cow for a new build, having 7 rows milking. So you could then, within that range, you'd be talking about, some people may go second hand, some people have a higher grant, some people convert into existing sheds. But if you put the whole lot together, you wouldn't be you could be over 4,000 to 5,000 a cow, including the cow value. Most people will use their own stock to buy their stock, but if you have just land that needs a lot of conversion, it could cost up to 5,000 a cow to convert that farm, including the cow.
And just to pick up on one or two things, you mentioned cubicles. You're looking at €1,100 for a cubicle space per cow, and an additional $530 to $550 for slurry storage. There's a lot of people going with the topless cubicle option at the moment, Patrick. Is that simply a cost-saving measure?
Yeah, so the topless cubicles, it'll depend on the area you're in and the rainfall. So when you go topless, you obviously catch more rainfall. You're saving on the roof. So if you're going topless, you would tend to go for a lower cost slurry option. So you would go for a lagoon or an overground tower. So a slatted tank in the ground will cost roughly anywhere between €90 to €100 a cubic metre of slurry storage. And if you're generating more slurry through catching the rainfall, you would have to move into a lower cost of slurry storage. So an overground tower would depend on the size of it, be anywhere between 35 to 45 a cubic meter, and a lagoon would be again 15 to 35 depending on the scale. So when we're looking at the topless cubicles and as a rough breakdown, I would normally say a third, a third, a third. So the slurry storage in a cubicle house is a third. The cubicles themselves are a third, and the roof is a third. So if you're taking about 15 or 1600 euros to do a cubicle house, they'll each cost about 500 each. So when you're going topless, we will save the 500 on the roof per cow, but would have to go, instead of, if we make it back up with static accommodation, it will bring you back close to the full housing, so you'd have to move back into a lower cost slurry option.
And so can you sum that up just in terms of what you'd estimate the topless cubicle to cost, say if you were to
I would normally work in around 800 to 900 euro a cow.
And is this a long-term option for farmers, or you see that a lot of farms with the topless cubicles will have pillar structure in place that they can roof it eventually? Is the topless cubicle a long-term option, or do people plan to roof it in the long term?
The majority of farmers set it up so they'd put in the stanchion bases and the girders that will be plated, so it'll be very easy to bolt on the roof thereafter. So it'll depend over time and how finances look, but most would consider roofing it at a later point to save on that rainwater that has to be spread annually, and the cost of it. It'll also increase their slurry capacity, so the amount of rainfall they will catch if they roofed it, would increase their capacity by the same extent.
And another question in terms of your estimations of cost. The milking parlour, you're looking at on average €1,400 per cow for a 7-row milking system. Like, are some farmers rowing back on that cost by saying I'm going to milk 10 rows?
Yeah, so the parlour, there's a lot of variability within the parlour, so there could be second hand, and there's people that can avail of the higher grants and so forth on. The way I worked the figures was including the bulk tank and the feeding system. So you got the total cost, and if you're on average doing 7 rows, that's how you got the cost per cow. But if you want to look at the parlour on an individual basis, usually the milking parlour will cost somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 a unit for including the shed and the holding yard at the back. All these figures I mentioned now are excluding VAT. And I would put that down as half and half. So say if you're at 8,000, £4,000 would be for the building work and £4,000 would be for the unit cost itself. I will say on the milking parlour, there's massive variability in the range and the spec of the parlour you'll put in. So if you go in for a very, very high spec parlour, you could spend 6,000, 7,000 to 8,000 on a unit just on the plant itself. Bulk tank will cost anywhere between 220 to 250 a litre new. Or some people are buying it second hand, where it will cost €1 to €1.50 a litre on it. So a lot of it will depend on the finish and the cost of it and how many cows you're going to put through it. But some people, what you'd find with the new entrants, or some people with the grants that are there at the present, they're probably going for slightly larger parlours to allow for further expansion down the line and using the grant to give themselves additional units.
And when you refer to 7 rows, like, we often hear from the experts in terms of labour efficiency and labour management that 7 rows is the optimum number. Like, do you kind of agree with that, or do you see it differently?
When I'm doing my figures, I would always work at 10 to 11 minutes a row. So if you're in 7, if you're in 10, you'd be an hour and a half in the pit. Twice a day, be 3 hours, and that's only in the pit. You'll also have the time getting in cows in and out. I would say 7 long term is practical, but some people in an expansion phase for a number of years will run the number of rows up, maybe 10 or 12. To, as you say, maybe if the 60 acres came up opposite the ditch and they have to invest in that they may, for a number of years, increase the number of rows they're willing to do. Or some people will hire extra labour, so bring extra labour, so they're alternating milkings. So it's very individual, depending on the farm that you're on.
And if we look towards the costs, like you've detailed a lot of costs that are incurred with, I suppose, whether it's a new entrant, a complete new build, or whether you're expanding your dairy business. In terms of what it's costing now versus what it cost in 5 years, are we seeing a lot of inflation and a bigger cost to people compared with, say, 5 or 8 years ago?
Yes, so the cost of the concrete, the building work, will in line with the improvement in the economy, to get builders and the specification at the cost of steel and concrete has creeped up over time. The parlours themselves probably have been relatively static over the last number of years. So if you look at the costings from 5 years ago, they're fairly much in line where they were, and receding and all that. So I would say of it, probably the building costs have crept the most, and the rest have been relatively similar to when we started doing the business plans post quota.
And then back to the open day, Patrick. I was looking at your board at the Moore Park Open Day in 2019, and you had some points in about contingency. Do many farmers put say a contingency fund into their plans in case of an overrun in their development?
No, and I suppose it's one area from any farm or any business looking to expand, it's the capital budget. So expansion is hard on cash flow. So it takes a lot of money to build a business, and that we don't even have to talk about dairy. And if you go to any walk of life, to grow that business is hard on cash flow because you're investing back in your farm. You may not be getting the output that you hope to get, or and performance may be affected. So within that, if we have an inadequate capital budget, so if we don't allow for contingency or we forget about some elements of it, say usually it's the grazing infrastructure, so we don't cost that properly, we can have an area where the money is required and it's coming out cash flow, which can put the business on under a lot of pressure, especially in them expansion years. So on a small sort of project, say if you're only doing a small shed, there's no major need for a large contingency. But in some of the work what some farmers are doing now, there is a need for a contingency, and I would say and we would tend to work between 10 and 15% of the budget to allow for overruns, to allow for unforeseens. So it could be simple things when you're digging the tank, hitting rock, hitting water, whatever. And as the project gets bigger, there's more areas where things can go a little bit off. So we would tend to work between 10 to 15% on the contingency of the capital budget.
And you've alluded to it just now, but you also spoke when we were talking about the stock type that you'd invest in. You know, looking at the heifer, you know, you're estimating that a heifer will produce 70% of a cow, the mature cow, and your second lactation maybe 85%. Is this included in the business plan? Like, you know, how is this explained in the business plan?
So when we're looking at the business plan, obviously there's two types of farmers. So an existing dairy farmer, we can look back at their previous records to see what level of performance the herd had over the last 2 or 3 years. And within reason, we can budget forward using their previous history. From a new entrant point of view, because they're changing system, their previous performance, while it may indicate how good of a farmer they are, it's not relevant, I should say. So what we would normally do then is start with all heifers, and we would usually work between 330 and 350 kilos of milk solids in the first year, and incrementally lift it up to year 5 and 6 in the business plan. So it'd be from 330 to 350 kilos going up to 400 to 430 kilos of milk solids. So we'd bring it from average to average. So we never expect or plan for the farmers to be the best in class. We allow for it to be an average performance, and if they outperform it, so be it, and there's extra cash in the business. Most new entrants will, so a lot of new entrants would hit probably 370, 380 kilos of milk solids in the first year, and some will hit over 400 in year 2. But we'd still budget on the safer side, just to allow for unforeseens and not to be putting the business under pressure initially.
And then talk about milk price. You know, say somebody's looking at, you know, estimating what the business will do, and they haven't necessarily brought their business plan to you just yet. What sort of milk price should they be looking at?
We would work off at a base price at 3.3 protein, 3.6 fat at 28 cents a litre. We do make a milk solids adjustment based on the fats and protein in the herd. So we use €5.50 a kilo protein and €2.50 a kilo fat. So it's relatively conservative, be slightly below the average of the last 10 or 11 years of milk price, and we'll run that consistently through the business. So for each year, we'll use the same price. So we don't vary the base price. The only thing that will change is potentially the fats and protein of the herd, which may increase the milk price over time.
And finally, Pat, for anyone considering growth within their business, or indeed any of our listeners that are, engaging in other farming enterprises at the moment, can you sum up with your top 3 tips for, how they can ensure their farm business will work for them, going forward?
So when we're looking at expansion or change in your business, the first thing is a business plan. To sit down, go through it with your advisor, whoever, your accountant, and just to make sure that at the end of the day, why are we expanding? It's usually to make more money, whether it be for to put kids to college or for future growth down the line. And you'd have to look at when you get to the expanded herd. So again, back to your original example of the 60 acres outside the ditch. And if you take that on, when the business stops growing, have we more money? Are we just working? Are we worse off? So I suppose it's to assess each opportunity and make sure at the end when the thing is expanded that there is more money in it. Secondly, I come back to the capital budget. I think a proper capital budget, well thought out, everything considered, is very important. So in a lot of the plans we'd see where we were asked to look at them, if the capital budget is poor or underfunded, it means the business plan is therefore wrong straight away, because you're not borrowing for enough money, or you haven't taken all levels of capital expenditure through the cash flow or through the business plan. And the key area I would say to any, and it's probably, I know particularly for a new entrant point of view, when they look to convert, there's a lot of excitement and nervousness around getting their farm right and doing the right thing and looking at the yard and where the parlour should go and all them type things. The key thing is sourcing the right type of stock. And I think at this day, there's so many good herds out there with figures, high EBIs, co-op performance reports, is to use the figures and the information is there to source the top of the range stock. And that will stand you for the next 10, 15 years over your career in dairying.
And I suppose, on a final note, you've highlighted a lot of people that can help us in making these plans, the advisor, the accountant, and I suppose yourself, Patrick, within the Dairy Expansion Service, you're available and willing to help people, to look at these opportunities and I suppose identify whether they're right or wrong for farmers. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Patrick Gowing for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.